for forest ecology. He's authored more than 200 publications with 275 co-authors from 25 countries. He's listed among the top 1% of all scientists in the world in the ecology and environment category by Web of Science. His research has been featured in the news media 500 times, including the New York Times, Newsweek, and Washington Post. Currently, his research interests include large-scale fire and wind, earthworm invasion, and climate change in temperate and boreal forests. So with that, thank you so much, Lee, for joining us, and I will stop sharing.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. Let me share my screen here. There we go. That should be show mode at this point. Whoops. So anyway, I should say I have a long history in Wisconsin. I was actually born in Janesville and grew up there and published the flora of Newport State Park as a undergraduate student in botany at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1979, and then went to the other end of Linden Drive and got a PhD in forest ecology with Craig Lorimer, and then was immediately stolen by Minnesota and have been here ever since. So I'm going to talk about the impacts of earthworm invasion in forests today, and just a brief summary of the things they're going to cover. First, they degrade the soil. They exacerbate the effects of climate change, interact with deer to disrupt plant communities. So those are some of the major points. I am not the first one to discover that earthworms are important. In fact, Darwin wrote an entire book about earthworms in 1881. It was the last thing he published just before he died, and quite a while after the origin of the species. And he did a lot of research on this, one of the most important invasive species, the nightcrawler, Lumbricus terrestris. So he was the real pioneer here. So there's not only global warming, there's also global worming in terms of invasive worms. And the continents on this map show the 17 taxonomic families of earthworms. The families that are listed in blue are native to that continent. The ones in the light red have both introduced and indigenous taxa. And the families shown in the darker red have introduced taxa only. So as you can see, invasive earthworms are everywhere in the world except Antarctica. So there is a global warming phenomenon. They are having huge impacts in tropical forests, even in the Amazon. In the heart of the Amazon, there are invasive earthworms coming from other tropical areas. Our invasive worms here are from either Asia or Europe. So our first wave of earthworm invasion was from Europe, came with European settlers to the United States. So there aren't, well, Minnesota has no native earthworms. Wisconsin actually has two native earthworm species. One is an aquatic worm and the other is Diplocardia. And it's found in the very southeastern part of Wisconsin. So most of northern Wisconsin was earthworm free, just like Minnesota, the same for upper Michigan, northern lower Michigan, and even the northern parts of New England. So the first wave was the European earthworms, and the second wave, which is the jumping worms that come from Asia, are just getting started in the Midwest. And so they're only in the cities at this point. They're just starting to spread out into forested areas. And of course, you have Brad Herrick there, who's doing research on jumping worms at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum and is also working on his PhD, and I'm on his advisory committee for that. So there are several jumping worm research projects underway now. So earthworms have ecological classes. So the anisic species, which includes the nightcrawler, build vertical burrows. They use the same burrow for their entire life. They feed at the surface, eating leaves. The endogeic species drill new burrows all the time. They don't reuse burrows. They basically stay in about the top 15 to 18 inches of the soil. Don't show up on the surface very often, except to mate early in the spring. And the epigeic species actually live in the leaf litter and live on the surface and don't really go into the mineral soil. So these are some of those. So the night crawlers here. The endogeics are mostly Aporectidea species, and they're also referred to as angleworms. They tend not to have very much pigment because they're rarely exposed to sunlight. Dendrobana is one of our epigeic species. It comes from northern Scandinavia, and it can actually freeze during the winter and then thaw out in the next spring and be just fine. So, and then Lumbricus rubellus is a relative of the nightcrawler. People think they're baby nightcrawlers. They're actually a different species, very similar anatomy. They also are heavily pigmented, and they live on the surface and the top few inches of mineral soil. So we call them epiendogeic. And the jumping worms that we'll get to towards the end of the talk are also in that epiendogeic class that lives on the surface in the top few inches of the mineral soil. So those are the characters. What earthworms do for a living is eat dead organic matter. And of course, the vast majority of that comes from plants, from leaves that they shed, deciduous leaves, and so on. So basically, compared to a non-earthworm infested forest, an earthworm infested forest is like stepping on the gas pedal and turning over the organic matter much faster than it would with our native decomposers in this area. And it's also important to note the actual decomposition occurs inside the worm with microbes inside the worm. But it's the worm that stirs up the leaf litter, helps fragment it, and that eats it, and is the vessel that contains the actual decomposition going on inside the worm. And how do they get here? Well, how many potted plants do you think the European settlers brought with them when they came from Europe? My grandmother came from Sweden in 1912, and she brought some potted plants with her. And there was also ballast that was often soil that they put in ships. It could be bags of soil that they used as ballast in ships, and that was ended up being dumped here. But the plants the settlers took with them all over the place, wherever they settled. So they were introduced in cities first, and then they spread to agricultural areas and finally to forests. And the forest spread is mainly fishing bait. And the big explosion was from the 1960s through the early 2000s for the European worms, that fishing bait live fishing bait became very popular. There are like 800 bait shops in Minnesota. I'm sure Wisconsin has just as many. There are even vending machines that sell live earthworms. And then those get distributed to lake shores where people are fishing, and then the worms spread from there, and then they get picked up by ATVs and so on, and eventually get spread all through the forest. So that's how they get around. Even the Boundary Waters Wilderness in northern Minnesota is about 30% infested. And so this is a map of that, and the red and yellow areas have European earthworm infestation, and you'll notice they're in a pattern, and those are the popular canoe routes, including the portage trails. So earthworms can only move about 10 meters per year by themselves. So if they were introduced in Minneapolis in the mid 1800s, it would take them literally thousands of years to get to the Boundary Waters, but it turns out earthworms go exactly where people go. So the fact that they move slow on their own is not a factor. People help them get around so much, either as potted plants or nursery stock or fishing bait, that they go everywhere that people go. We found them on the North Slope in Alaska. Um, they're they're at several hundred locations through northern Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, um, even a little bit into the Northwest Territories in Canada. So they get around. Most of our studies and what we've learned about earthworm invasion come from leading edge of invasion studies. Because in northern Wisconsin, upper Michigan, and northern Minnesota, the entire landscape is not invaded yet. So we have these leading edges of invasion. And we can put plots on either side of that, compare the differences, and also observe differences on a worm-free plot when the invasion front goes through. So we've done a lot of and published a lot of studies using that technique. And to get the worms out of the ground, we sample them using ground yellow mustard powder, the same kind that you use as a spice in cooking. The ground yellow powder, we buy it in bulk though, because otherwise we'd buy out all the grocery stores in the Twin Cities because we use a lot of it. And it's basically about 1/3 of a cup in a gallon of water. So we use old milk jugs, so that's our highest tech piece of scientific equipment. Mix it on site, pour it on the ground within a frame. We have frames that are like 1/10 of a square meter in area. Pour it gradually over a period of 15 minutes, wait for the worms to come to the surface because it irritates their skin. And when they do, you grab them with tweezers and stick them in one of these Glad lunch boxes with some alcohol in it. So that's our other high-tech piece of equipment. And take them back to the lab where they can be identified and permanently preserved. The stages of invasion are earthworm-free, usually has an organic horizon several inches thick. It's like walking on a memory foam mattress. When I was a kid in Door County or anywhere in northern Wisconsin, most of the forests were like that, and even some of the forests in southern Wisconsin. And you'll note that the leaves are matted down and they're leached, so they're kind of white in color because the snow sits on them all winter, and then all that water percolates through, takes the color out of them, and you can pick it up. It's like a big mass of roofing felt or something. It's all knit together by fungal hyphae. And the further north you go, the thicker it is. A lot of places in upper Michigan, it's 4 or 5 inches. It can be much thicker than that in northern Minnesota. And then the epigeic worms invade first. They travel much more rapidly. They're parthenogenetic. Dendrobana, that little epigeic species. All these species are introduced together because when you buy fishing bait that's called night crawlers, we discovered usually there are other species in there. And they all spread at different speeds. So the epigeic go faster, so it's like a chromatography, like on a landscape scale. So stage 2 is epigeic only, then stage 3, the endogeics, the angleworms, those Aparectidea species get there. And at that point, the organic horizon starts to thin a little bit, especially when Lumbricus rubellus arrives. And then when Lumbricus terrestris arrives, the invasion is mature. And that could be a few decades after the epigeic species get there. And at that point, the Lumbricus terrestris will eat all the new leaves that fall every year and maintain bare soil conditions at midsummer indefinitely. So this is one of our experiments we did early on where we took plugs of forest floor from earthworm-free sugar maple forests, and this is from the north shore of Lake Superior. On the ridge top, they're actually sugar maple forests. They're far enough away from Lake Superior to be away from the cold air during the summer. And on the ridge top, they don't get the cold air drainage in the winter, which at minus 55 degrees in northern Minnesota in lowlands would kill sugar maple trees, of course, but we have this band of sugar maple forest that's earthworm free on the North Shore. So we took these plugs, and you can see how thick that organic horizon was. Humus at the bottom, the fragmented layer or fermentation layer, and then fresh leaves at the top. And we put them in containers in the greenhouse and then introduced worms. And only a few weeks later, it looked like the picture on the right, and you see the bubbly black things there, which are castings. You see all these fine beige things, which are the fine root systems of a sugar maple seedling, which is laying here. It's tipped over. The worms have literally eaten the rooting medium out from its rooting system. So that proved that this was actually an earthworm effect. We know they cause soil erosion because you get bare soil by midsummer, because the worms will eat the leaves. This is a 70-year-old sugar maple tree in an earthworm infested area, and there's been about 3 or 4 inches of erosion. The jumping worms are going to accelerate that erosion even more. But the European earthworms also cause a much higher rate of soil erosion than you would get under natural conditions with that organic horizon covering. So they consume the organic horizon, which changes seedbed conditions. They increase the bulk density of the A horizon, usually by 20 or 30%. Without the insulation of the organic horizon, we know from our measurements that summer soil temperatures go up about 4 degrees Celsius, and that is gigantic to have a soil temperature change that big. So literally the root systems of these forests have already experienced the level of warming that we expect for the climate by the end of the 20th century for a high emission scenario. So the root systems have already experienced that level of warming. They exacerbate drought effects because of that much warmer soil, and because the rain doesn't soak in as readily because of the high bulk density, because they cement the soil particles together with their mucus. That's why it's high bulk density. And they cause leaching losses of nutrients. NPK, calcium, and magnesium are ones that we've measured on our sites. And those are lost and typically end up being anywhere from 20% to 50% lower. And this shows NH4NO3 and PO4 from one of our study sites, but you get similar results for calcium and magnesium and potassium. And the minimally invaded areas are the black bars, and the heavily invaded are the gray bars. And then it also shows that the total earthworm biomass is much higher, of course, in the heavily invaded sites, and the leaf litter, the organic horizon, is gone. And the reason the nutrients leach out is because the earthworms actually start eating the leaves when they fall off the trees in October. And the root systems of the trees are pretty dormant at that time of year because the soils are starting to get cold, but the earthworms actually have maximum activity when the temperatures are in the 40s and 50s Fahrenheit. So they eat the leaf litter, and if you get rain, then it leaches away. The nutrients are released by the worms, and it leaches down through the soil without being grabbed by the trees or the understory plants that are dormant at that time of year. So it's basically an October and April thing, where the worms are active when the plants are dormant, and they're releasing nutrients that can then leach away. And we know that this reduces the growth rate of trees. We did a tree ring analysis on the two sides of our earthworm invasion fronts in sugar maple forests in northern Minnesota, and there was also this study done at Michigan Tech, looking at 120 sites in northern Wisconsin, upper Michigan, and even northeastern Minnesota. And it shows basal area increment from 1950 to the early 2000s in the graph there. And that heavy black line, that is the fully invaded, where it's Lumbricus terrestris, and the growth rates are about 30% less in terms of wood accumulation or biomass accumulation by sugar maple trees. And of course, their mycorrhizae are disrupted. The roots are feeling the drought stress and the high soil temperatures, and that causes dieback in the crowns of sugar maple. And the earthworms were the only significant factor predicting that type of crown dieback, like you see in the picture on the left in this study shown here. So here's a picture of one of our study sites before earthworm invasion. And if you look really fast and really carefully here, I always show this and ask my students to count the number of plant species that they see. And I get about 11. There's some pen sedge, there's probably a lady fern there, there's some Solomon seal and twisted stalk, there's some yellow violet, some myanthemum here, sugar maple seedlings, of course. About 11 species, and here's the after picture. Seedling density of sugar maple is down by 98%. All of those plants were rooted in the organic horizon, which was eaten. The standing crop of plants was mostly killed, and it's hard to get the seed source for them to recover. And you can see the recession of the forest floor because the organic horizon is gone and the A horizon is compacted. So even the A horizon is a little bit lower than it was. And you see an unhappy sugar maple tree here. This is not how the root system of a sugar maple tree should look. So if you see this in old sugar maple trees in southern Wisconsin or anywhere in Wisconsin in mesic sugar maple forest, this means that the forest floor is receded because of earthworm invasion. And these are some of our graphs from some of our studies of species richness. And this one shows for Chequamegon and Chippewa National Forests, which are northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, the number of species per plot that we had, and looking at that along a gradient of Lumbricus abundance in terms of biomass of Lumbricus earthworms. So the more earthworms there are, the lower the species richness. And there's a lot of scatter, but it's still a very significant negative slope. And then this is a different study that a different student, Cindy Hale, did, where we had a losers and winners column here, and then there's also a species area curve there, and the lower curve is the Lumbricus terrestris, the fully invaded, compared to the early stage of earthworm invasion where you just have the epigeic species of earthworms. So some of the losers are bellwort, spikenard, yellow violet, trillium. Well, you can read the list there. Jack in the pulpit tends to do well because of its oxalic acid. The worms avoid it, the deer avoid it. Pen sedge does really well. It can grow, even if the mycorrhizal community's been disturbed, it can grow in a non-mycorrhizal fashion. And it tends to like the warm, dry conditions that the earthworms create at midsummer, so it does very well. And some of the things that earthworms do to seeds, just to use one example here, this species of Goodyeara orchid, the seeds can be buried by the earthworm. They can go in the earthworm and be cast out several inches below the surface. Have no chance of being successful if they germinate down there. they can be cast out on the surface and maybe germinate, but or not germinate because they lost viability while going through the digestive system. And then the fungal environment is changed, and it turns out that they require this symbiotic fungus that is largely destroyed by the earthworm invasion. So, and then there's the overall change in the seedbed structure. So a lot of things work against certain native plants when the earthworms invade. And then there's the temperature effects and the drought effects as well, and the lower nutrient status of the soil. So winners and losers. However, there's another part to the story that we'll get to in a few minutes, which involves deer, which I already mentioned, which comes into which species are winners and losers. So we'll get to that in a few minutes because there's an interaction between the earthworms and the deer. But before we get to that, I wanted to mention that the earthworms also favor invasive plant species that come from their home continent. Buckthorn, for example, the common buckthorn is very common and invasive, and these buckthorn germinate on bare mineral soil. So Lumbricus terrestris, it turns out one of my PhD students did a study and found this synergistic relationship between buckthorn and Lumbricus terrestris. The worms make a perfect seed bed, and the leaves of buckthorn are a perfect food source. And so you get much higher earthworm densities under buckthorn, and the earthworms have facilitated the invasion of buckthorn by reducing the organic horizon thickness. Not surprising, because again, they co-evolved on their home continent. Although in Europe, you only see like one buckthorn per hectare or something like that. So there are other factors in addition to the earthworms that let them become super abundant here. But they are facilitated, and in fact, a lot of invasive plant species are known to be facilitated by earthworm invasion, such as Japanese barberry. Hemp nettle is starting to invade some places in northern Wisconsin. I'm not sure if I've seen stiltgrass yet in Wisconsin or Minnesota, but it's known to come into earthworm invaded areas out east. And of course, Tatarian honeysuckle and garlic mustard are pretty common in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they are facilitated as well by earthworm invasion. So it turns out the changes earthworms cause to the organic horizon and the bulk density, the soil structure, and changing the temperature alters the microbial community. It alters the habitat in individualistic ways that affect different plant species. It changes the plant community, and of course changes the habitat of vertebrate species and other wildlife species that use plants as their habitat. So there's lots of what we call micro cascades that change things, and that can lead to these macro cascades, which are defined as things of concern to society, like reduction in wildlife or habitat, changes in plant community composition, reduction of forest productivity, reduction in soil and water quality because the phosphorus leaches out of the soil and goes in the water, emitting CO2. All that organic matter the worms ate is respired and turns into CO2. Inability to do a prescribed burn because there's no longer a contiguous leaf litter layer, which is something managers would like to do in oak forests, especially, and facilitating invasive species. And these cascades actually form complexes that are interlinked. Giant ragweed, it turns out, germinates much better if it's right next to a Lumbricus terrestris burrow, and that causes allergies for people. The environment for ticks is changed on the forest floor, which influences Lyme disease. The buckthorn is the overwintering host for soybean aphids. which not only caused damage for soybean farmers in adjacent soybean fields, but are the food source for the Asian lady beetles that gather on people's houses. And some people are allergic to those, so there are human health consequences of these interlinked cascades. The nutrient loss, of course, causes reduction in forest productivity, which affects the economy, and the change in the fire regime and the drought and the other impacts affect forest diversity, which is an environment concern. So lots of cascading impacts. Okay, now let's get to the deer thing that I mentioned, where the winners and losers in the native plant community are not determined only by the earthworms, but also by the deer and the interaction between the worms and the deer. So this is some research that one of my graduate students, David Augustine, did way back in the mid 1990s. And he's now in Fort Collins, Colorado, and does research on ungulates. So when he was here, he did research on deer, and he studied trilliums, discovered that deer hugely reduced the ability of trillium to successfully flower and set seed. But he also studied the wood nettle, as you can see here. And he did deer density in terms of deer photographed per week, and had 6 motion detector cameras in each of 12 woodlands. And then moved those to different trees every 2 weeks throughout the summer, and was able to get summer deer density in terms of deer photographed per week. He also got lots of photographs of school kids on field trips, but they go away at 3:30. Let's see. So here you see the herbivory on wood nettle, and they resprout down below. They do reduce the height. And it turns out that the lower the stem density of the wood nettle, the higher the proportion are grazed by deer. And what happens is earthworms lower the plant density when they invade, and so they shift everything to the left on this curve, where the deer to plant ratio is higher because there are fewer plants but still the same number of deer, and then each plant is more likely to be grazed. And therefore you can drive the whole plant community to extinction in some cases on the forest floor. So what we found is that when you have low deer, and this is for southern Minnesota, this is probably in the range of 5 deer per square mile, I think. And you only need 40 plants per acre to satiate the deer. At medium deer density, which is kind of typical for southern Minnesota, and you're around 15 or 20 deer per square mile, you need 400 plants per acre to satiate the deer, so the deer can eat all they want and you still have a plant community. And it's important to note that if the wood nettle is there, the trilliums and the orchids and the other things can grow underneath them. At high deer density, you need 2,400 plants per acre, and that's when you get up to 40 deer per square mile. So it's not a linear scale by any means. So I knew somebody who wanted to restore a forest that had been an old growth forest, had never been logged, but the understory plant community was completely decimated by the deer and the worms. And went to the native plant nursery and got like 20 trilliums and planted them throughout the woods. And they were all eaten by deer, of course, within a few days. But if you have a high deer and you need 2,400 plants per acre and you want to restore 10 acres, you need to buy 24,000 plants, and you're not going to find 24,000 of anything on the shelf in a native plant nursery. And even then, well, what we discovered is what you can do is build some deer exclosures, get the plants started there, get them to a high density, and then the propagules will start going out through the deer fence, and the surrounding forest will start to recover if you have enough propagules, and modestly lower the deer population at the same time. And this is a study that was just published in Ecology in 2023 from the Moss experiment in northern Wisconsin, where they made artificial gaps, and they had gap areas that were fenced to keep deer out and that weren't, and overstory canopy areas that were fenced to keep deer out and weren't. And it turns out that the highest earthworm density is when you're under forest canopy, not in a gap, and have deer. And the lowest earthworm density was when you're in a gap and don't have deer. So it turns out that deer themselves cause a higher earthworm density. So not only do the earthworms decrease the plant density, which allows the deer to have a bigger impact, but the deer then in turn also increase the earthworm density, which has more impacts on the plants and negative impacts on the plants, which enables even bigger negative impacts of the deer. So there is this interaction between worms and deer, which is very, very important in determining what the winner and loser list for plant species is. And when you have late stage earthworm invasion and a high deer density, you basically can't expect to have anything much more than Carex pennsylvanica and maybe some jack in the pulpit. And then there's a whole gradient of different conditions with different levels of earthworm invasion and different levels of productivity of the forest. Some sites are so rich that even after some of the nutrients leach away, they're still rich, and some aren't. So you get a whole gradient of conditions across the landscape with different deer densities, different levels of earthworm invasion, and different levels of soil productivity. But in the extreme, you can have a difference like this picture and the following picture will show. This is a big woods or maple basswood and red oak forest about 40 miles south of the Twin Cities. It is earthworm infested, but it has a high deer to plant ratio. And as you can see, it's very lush, a lot of wood nettle, a lot of other plant species growing under the wood nettle. We tallied about 90 plant species here. Very few invasives, if any, invasive plant species. And here's one at the other end of the gradient. High stage of earthworm invasion, very high deer density. And this is an old growth forest that was never logged. It is starting to recover now because the deer density has gone down, and we put the deer exclosures there, and the propagules from the plants inside the deer exclosures are beginning to repopulate some parts of the forest. So the whole forest decline syndrome is summarized here. Earthworm introduction, loss of the duff, wiping out a lot of the standing crop of tree seedlings and plants that were rooted in the organic horizon, higher deer to plant ratio, warmer, drier soils, more nutrient poor, and you may also have an increase in pen sedge, and all of that together leads to forest dieback, regeneration failure, and a lush herb community replaced by either simple community or invasive species like buckthorn and garlic mustard. So sugar maple forests in the future with a much warmer climate and earthworm invasion and high deer might look more like the lower picture instead of the upper picture here. I think Carex pennsylvanica will do very well with warmer climate. In fact, we did an experiment that shows that with 4 degrees Celsius of warming, and we did this in growth chambers, and earthworms, it does very well, and so do all the European invasive plant species. Okay, on to the second wave here, in the last few slides here. The Asian worms or jumping worms, 14 species in North America. Most are Amynthus or metaphyre species. Those are the 2 genera. They move around in mulch. They aren't used as much as fishing bait. They're more aggressive than European worms, tend to replace them, in fact, tend to replace the nightcrawler. They're annual species. They survive the winter as eggs. They don't live for years and years like a nightcrawler. And here's how to tell the difference. The jumping worm has the clitellum, which is the band that goes around the worm. Very close to the nose. It starts at segment 14, usually, if you count the segments from the nose to the clitellum. Whereas on a nightcrawler, it's 32 segments. And the various European earthworm species, it's anywhere from segment 23 to 32. So the clitellum is much further from the nose. So that's how to tell the difference. You need to do that in late summer, though, when the jumping worms, which are annuals, they don't get mature until mid-July or August. So, and that's their life cycle. Juveniles in May or June start to mature in July, and they're adult through October, and then they only survive the winter as eggs in silken cocoons. And this is a map of their occurrence. The sites in Wisconsin are presumably due to the research done at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum by Brad Herrick, and all of these sites in Minnesota were discovered as a result of my research program on jumping worms, which has been going since 2019. And so they get around in mulch and nursery stock. They go to community mulch piles and then go to lots of houses from there. And then we're worried that what's going to happen is they'll go from urban gardens to cabin gardens in northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, because people take plants from their urban gardens to their cabins. And from there they can spread into forests and other natural habitats. The jumping worms turn the soil into granules that are loose, like cat litter or like coffee grounds. So that's a difference. And then instead of the hard packed surface you get with the European worms, you get loose granules. So these are sites that we're studying in maple, basswood, and red oak forests at the University of Minnesota Arboretum. And all the red dots are clusters of plots on either side of, in this case, it's the jumping worm invasion front progressing into a mature European earthworm invasion. Large impacts on soil erosion, soil temperature, water and nutrient status, and plant diversity. For example, the bulk density is lowered by the jumping worms. So when the European worms invade, they raise the bulk density, and the jumping worms invade and they put it back down to the bulk density it was before the European earthworms invaded. They also cool the soil because those granules have air spaces between them. So it doesn't conduct the heat into the soil during the summer. And we've discovered that the Amynthus infested areas are as much as 4 degrees Celsius cooler in the summer compared to the European earthworm infested areas. And you'll remember I said earlier, the European worms raise the temperature 4 degrees Celsius, while now these jumping worms cool at 4 degrees. So it's back to what the expected temperature would be in a maple basswood forest in this region. However, they also reduce native plant species richness, and so we're starting with a reduced native plant species richness from the European earthworm invasion, and there's a further reduction by the jumping worms. And so here we only had 7.5 acres or 3 hectares of jumping worm infested area to work with. But at that scale, we were getting 25 fewer species of native plants on the forest floor in the jumping worm infested compared to European. And we think that's because the soil is so loose that seedlings can't take root. And they're also likely to exacerbate soil erosion, as I said, because you have all these loose granules. So the health of these ecosystems, even though the bulk density and the soil temperature has been restored to good ranges for these forests, if the soil actually erodes away, that, could threaten the fundamental health. And so that's why we just recently got a grant from the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center, which is a center on campus of the University of Minnesota that has about $8 million a year that they give away in grants to study various invasive species. And it's actually funded by the lottery in Minnesota by a constitutional amendment. But anyway, my friend Kyung-Soo Yu, who's a soil scientist, and I and a couple other people just got a $430,000 grant, which starts right now in January 2024, to study this soil erosion problem in maple basswood forests. And at least in Minnesota, almost all the maple basswood forests are on steep slopes because anything that's flat has been turned into cornfields and soybean fields. So it is a threat to those remnant bigwoods forests. And maybe I can come back in a couple years and tell you what we found, but we're just beginning this research on soil erosion. And we're going to use cesium-137, which is everywhere in the world from atomic bomb tests in the 50s and 60s. And by comparing the amount of that in the soil at the top and bottom of the slopes in the European and the jumping worm infested areas, we'll be able to tell if the rate of erosion is greater. We'll also do the standard things like putting pins in the soil to see if the actual level changes. And we're also going to plant native plant understories of species that are easy to find in native plant nurseries and that take root easily, like columbine and zigzag goldenrod, to see if we can halt the erosion or at least slow it down. And we will measure the erosion separately in those planted plots of native plant species. Oh, so that is all that I plan to say. And just to acknowledge the MIT PPC, the Forest Service, the Environmental Trust Fund, and NSF, and some of the wealthy people who have donated money to my research here, before I open it up for questions. If there's time, maybe I used up all the time.
No, there's definitely time for questions. Thanks, Lee. That was great. Yeah, I think we can try just having people unmute themselves and try to talk. If it gets too crazy, then maybe we'll ask people to put questions in the chat. If people want to just put questions in the chat anyways, I can monitor that. But we can start by just trying to allow people to unmute themselves.
Yeah, well, it looks like Don Waller has a question right off the bat.
Hi, Lee. Good to see you and great talk. Lots of questions, but let me just start with one. Native earthworms presumably occurred here before the glaciation squashed them all. And has anyone tried bringing native earthworms back to see how they do head to head with either these recent Asian jumping worms or the European ones?
Well, there have been some accidental introductions of native worms from further south, in Itasca State Park, believe it or not, in northern Minnesota, and they are surviving there, but we don't have any studies. There have been some studies underway of native earthworms versus the Asian worms and the European worms. However, in Georgia, there's a whole group of earthworm ecologists there. And it seems they're like the native earthworms just slowly lose ground to either the Europeans or the Asians over a number of years. And not enough time has gone by to see if they ultimately go to extinction yet. So I don't have a really definitive answer to your question. but they do decline. They are not big and aggressive species compared to the European worms, and the European worms are not very aggressive compared to the jumping worms. So seems unlikely that those native earthworms would survive in competition.
And if I can ask one more question,
Sure.
we also found in the UW Arboretum that um, the earthworms were far more abundant underneath buckthorn, and like twice as abundant. But we also found much higher levels of soil nitrogen under that buckthorn, presumably because the buckthorn has nutrient-rich leaves. Is that you didn't go into that mechanism, but is that what's going on to how buckthorn benefits the lumber?
Yeah, I think so. And we suspect that there's also some nitrogen fixation by buckthorn,
Hmm.
but by different species of bacteria than you would normally think. And that it's not very well studied. But yeah, I agree that they do maintain a nutrient-rich environment. But I'm still not advocating filling the understory of all our forests with buckthorn, though.
Okay, well, keep up the great work. Thanks a lot.
It looks like Ryan O'Connor has his hand up.
Yeah, hi Lee. I was wondering if anyone has done any research or if you have any hypotheses about the impacts of earthworms on savanna ecosystems, especially ones that would have been burned regularly, would have those that leaf litter layer removed. In many places, the leaf litter is too dense in sites that are fire suppressed. And then I guess also maybe prairies, but I think I'm particularly interested in like oak openings, oak woodland, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and there isn't a really good answer to it's a good question. There's not a very good answer to it. Because there haven't been very many studies, but the few studies that there are indicate that the impacts on savannas and prairies is not as big. And that's probably because of the soil conditions in savannas and prairies, the high temperatures you get at midsummer could be even higher than they are where the earthworms have raised the temperature, but it's still shaded in a forest. And also because the organic matter is physically tougher, like graminoids have physically tough, and a lot of the prairie plants actually have thicker leaves and they're just too physically tough for the earthworms to eat. And so they don't seem to have the huge populations or the big impacts, but that's based on only a handful of studies. So that's something that we should probably look at more.
It looks like we have a number of questions in the chat. So Michael O'Brien asks, is there any way to decrease the density of earthworms in a forest?
There are a lot of ways to do it, but they aren't all legal. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of chemicals that can kill earthworms, and one of the things that we're doing is looking at some chemicals that are relatively environmentally friendly for controlling earthworm populations, like saponins, for example, or saponins. A lot of people pronounce it saponins, and these are chemicals that are actually in the leaves of a lot of plants, and especially in tea. And there's a lot of saponins that are a byproduct of the manufacture of tea. And golf course managers actually use a combination of fertilizer and saponins on golf course greens, and they get very good control of earthworms there. As you can't have any earthworms on a putting green because the castings are little hills, and the ball won't roll right. And they do get good control. And prior to that, they were using much harsher chemicals. I mean, saponins obviously are, in all the sap and dailies and in a lot of plants. I think even sugar maple has a little bit of saponin, not enough to control the worms, but there's a tiny bit there. And so we're trying that, especially the nursery at the University of Minnesota Arboretum is especially interested because they want to be able to distribute nursery stock that they can ensure is clean of invasive earthworms. And so saponins are probably a way to do that. We also tried Botanigard, which are fungal spores. And I can't tell you whether that's working yet. We're still in the middle of the research. We're also trying sulfur granules and some other things, but that research just isn't complete yet, so I can't say a whole lot about it other than it seems like the saponins actually work. And because people drink tea all the time and tea is full of saponins, we know for sure it's not a health problem for people. In fact, people buy saponins at health food stores and use it as supplements. So it has very different impacts on physiology depending on what branch of the evolutionary tree a given animal species is on. And if you're in the branch that the annelids are in, it's poisonous to you, but not for vertebrates.
Interesting. Let's see. Mike asks, is there any research looking at earthworm impacts in conifer versus hardwood stands?
Yeah, we have some research on that. And what we've noticed is that the earthworms are capable of eating hemlock, balsam fir, and white pine. And their needles are much less physically tough, much less acidic, and more nutrient rich than the needles of black or white spruce, jack pine, or red pine. So typically in red pine, jack pine, or spruce forests, you will find only Dendrobana, which is the epigeic species that lives in the leaf litter, and it's actually acid tolerant, and it comes from Scots pine forests in Sweden, was its original habitat. So it will live in conifer forests, and you might get a few endogeics, but it's unlikely that lumbricus can survive there, so the infestations are very limited in those conifer species. But in balsam fir and hemlock stands and some white pine stands on richer soils, you can actually have the organic horizon eaten by the worms, and you can have a full scale infestation of European earthworms. It won't move as fast through the forest because it's still not quite as palatable as maple and basswood leaves. So the invasion front won't move as fast. The density of earthworms might not be as high, but you can end up having the organic horizon eaten. We have some balsam fir stands in the boundary waters that have been totally eaten, and the balsam fir roots are just running along the surface of the soil, which is not something balsam fir would normally do. Yeah, there is that gradient of different conifers according to the physical toughness, the acidity, and the nutrient content of the needles.
Interesting. I've noticed, it's interesting you say that about hemlock, because I've noticed it seems like the impacts are usually less under hemlock, and I've always assumed it's the hemlock, the forest floor on the hemlock seems to just be very tough. I don't know if they have much like a dense layer of real shallow roots, but when you just kind of try to
Yeah.
move your finger through it, it's very tough. And so I've always assumed that impedes earthworm.
Yeah, well, I would say that for the hemlock forest, it's only when you get onto silt loams, loams and silt loams. Because, for example, the Porcupine Mountains has silt loams, and we're seeing some hemlock stands infested and losing their organic horizon there. Sylvania Wilderness, which is right on the border of Wisconsin, there is on the outwash plain, and the soil's 80% sand. It's much more nutrient poor, and we're finding that the earthworms are having a much more difficult time invading the hemlock forest there compared to a silt loam, which is moister and more nutrient rich. So, there's variability by soil type there.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, and then we still have earthworm-free, our big mapped plots that total 69 acres in Sylvania, which we're resurveying now for 30 years since they were first mapped by Margaret Davis and me in the early 1990s. 3 of them are still earthworm free, like totally earthworm free. And one of them is not earthworm free. It's heavily invaded. It has no regeneration whatsoever. But wolves have just moved into parts of Sylvania, and we discovered massive regeneration of tree seedlings on 3 of those permanent plots that never had tree regeneration before. So yeah, a lot of interesting observations and different site variability.
For sure. Let's see. So Charles, next question, Charles asks, are there any plants that inhibit earthworms, such as juglin species? You sort of got at this with some of the sapindales.
Yeah, I think so. Jack in the pulpit certainly, because there's some oxalic acid it's excreted from the roots, and the deer don't seem to like it as much either. So yeah, there can be plants, and of course the thing about the sedges and the graminoids in general is they have spicules on the leaves. And the earthworms don't like to eat those spicules. And if that's a big part of the leaf litter, you're going to have lower densities of earthworms there. So we think that after the earthworm populations peak, if then Carex pennsylvanica invades and becomes a solid understory like a lawn, the earthworm density would probably go down. They would not disappear because there would still be maple leaves and so on available, but the population would not be as high as it would before that lawn of pen sedge was established. And we've seen pen sedge lawns in areas with very low deer populations totally caused by the worms. And we've also seen pen sedge lawns on other sites that are not invaded by earthworms but have a high deer population. So either high deer or earthworms can cause a lawn of Pennsylvania sedge on the forest floor, and that of course is a very big competitor with all the other herbaceous species and with tree seedlings. And a lot of interesting variation there too. You know, for a while, people were arguing which caused pen sedge lawns, and it turns out both factors cause it.
Do you know, speaking of the deer worm situation, why deer seem to increase worm density? Is it because of the deer scat adds nutrients to the soil?
Yeah, we think so. That, well, for one thing, the deer, just by walking around with their hooves, they fragment the leaves. That makes it physically easier for the earthworms to eat the leaves, so they can eat the leaves faster, in essence. And then there are the nutrient inputs from the deer as well. And there could be other changes in the above ground versus below ground system that deer cause. So, but it's probably mostly a nutrient and a physical effects on the litter and nutrient inputs. And I should add that I have one permanent plot in the Porcupine Mountains, which, as you know, was never logged in an old growth multi-age sugar maple forest. And I mapped those permanent plots in 1981. And we just remapped them last summer. And there's an earthworm invasion front, Lumbricus terrestris, on this plot that has not moved 1 foot in 40 years. But it's in the upper elevations of the Porcupine Mountains where they get 20 to 30 feet of snow, and there are no deer there. And I'm just wondering, and in addition, the organic horizon is so thick there because the summers are so short and decomposition is so slow, there could be a lot more organic acids given off. It's actually a spodosol, even though it's not under conifers. And the organic matter decomposition is just so slow that it's highly acidic, even though it's a sugar maple forest. And so I'm thinking the fact that it's so slow and there's no deer is probably limiting the earthworm invasions. And basically they're just in an intermittent stream bed and they can't get out of it. they can't go beyond that.
Huh, it's amazing. Okay, so continuing on with people's questions, Mark asks, does frequent fire have an impact on earthworm invasion? He has a site in oak woodland in southwest Wisconsin on medium to heavy soil, and he's wondering what the impact of frequent, almost annual burning is.
Yeah, annual burning would be eventually have impacts on Lumbricus terrestris, the night crawler, which feeds on leaf litter at the surface. And they actually did an experiment in Georgia where they parameterized a demographic model of Lumbricus terrestris based on observations they made after understory prescribed burns there, and concluded that it would take annual burns for about 20 years to cause Lumbricus terrestris population to totally crash. So it will affect them. It probably will not affect the endogeic earthworms, the Aporectidea, and there might be some Octolasian as well, which are the two genera of endogeic species, because they're really feeding on mycorrhizae and fine roots and dissolved organic matter that's percolating through the soil. They don't feed on the surface. They don't feed particularly other than an incidental manner on leaf litter. So it probably wouldn't impact them, but it would affect the Lumbricus for sure.
Right. And then Sarah asks, we just have two more questions. Sarah asks, do you have much data on the rate of change in soil properties and plant diversity across the 5 invasion phases?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, actually the invading front blew through our sites at Leech Lake in northern Minnesota, which again is it's sugar maple, basswood, red oak. Blew through the whole site, and then another earthworm front came. We kept moving what we considered to be the edge of invasion, but then another front came from the other direction, and now the whole forest there is invaded, and so it can no longer serve as a leading edge of invasion site. And what I can tell you is they only move about 10 meters per year, but any given square meter, they would eat most of the leaf litter within a few weeks. And so you will see plants there with their fine root system exposed. And then a week or two later, you don't see anything because they died and shriveled up. So it's only when you're right at the invasion front and they just ate the organic horizon and exposed the fine root systems of the plants. You have to be there right at that time to see that. And so we saw that. So any given square meter, it happens, within a month or within a few weeks. And it moves about 10 meters. In a year where it rains continuously all summer, it could move maybe 15 meters in terms of the front advancing. And this is again for the Lumbricus part. The Dendrobaena blew through there. They can move 30 meters a year. But they're not the ones that cause the ecosystem change. So the Lumbricus, it's when the Lumbricus gets there that you really get the big change, and that moves 10 to 15 meters. In a drought year, it might not move at all. So, but on average, it's about 10 meters a year. And so our study lasted long enough that it blew through our site, and we actually were able to witness Botrychium mormo die. It's been proposed Botrychium mormo might go extinct because of earthworm invasion. We actually witnessed some of them die when the earthworms reached the spot where they were growing. But that, we could have only seen that if we went to this study site every year for 15 years, which we did, because we had 2 big National Science Foundation grants and we're doing intensive work. And but you need that observation, constant observation, to pick up on that sort of thing.
Huh. Yeah, and that's the global, Leech Lake is the global hotspot for Botrychium mormo. So
yeah, or at least it was.
It was, yeah. Okay, so last question, and it kind of picks up on a topic you just mentioned, which is soil moisture. Is there a soil moisture, for example, wet versus wet mesic versus mesic barrier that affects earthworm population levels or their impacts?
Yeah, basically, the wetter the soil stays, the more active the worms are. So it would be a gradient. Um, and, for example, they'll stay active longer in a silt loam during a drought. They'll stay active longer into the drought just because that soil type holds water longer than, say, a sandy loam. So yeah, it's just a gradient. The earthworms have a mucous membrane on the outside of their body, which is just like the mucous membrane you have inside your mouth. They have to be wet all the time, so the wetter the soil, the more active they are, the more they eat, the more they reproduce. If they do experience a drought, they go down to the bottom of their burrow, which could be 18 inches down for an Aporectidae, or it could be 3 or 4 feet down for a Lumbricus terrestris. They roll up in the ball and surround themselves with a mucus secretion that hardens and keeps them moist. And that's called estivation, and they can estivate through a drought and then wake up when the soil water starts percolating through at the depth where they're estivating again. So it's just a total water soil abundance gradient.
Well, thanks again so much, Lee. This Charles had a question about whether the presentation will be